Hey everybody, this episode is brought to you by our friends at Spring Creek Quail Farms, whose mission it is to make nutritious and delicious egg options available to all. You can find more about them at their website, www.springcreekquail.ca. A big thanks to them for sponsoring the show and making this conversation possible. Now, without further ado, on to Real Talk.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Real Talk podcast. Today we are joined by Reverend Dr. Joseph Boot. I'm not sure if you like the Reverend first or the Doctor first, but far too qualified to be speaking to us, but we're thankful that he is. So, Joe Boot comes at us from the Ezra Institute, where you are the founder and president, I guess. And also the founding pastor of Westminster Chapel in Toronto. You've done a lot of speaking, a lot of lectures, writing on all sorts of issues, cultural issues, and how we can engage the culture and stuff. So today, hopefully, we can dig into a little bit on the COVID issue and sphere sovereignty, and maybe pick your brain a little bit so we can better understand kind of where we're at and maybe what our path forward is. So, if give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and maybe your background and what you're working on these days, and then we'll get into it.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. It's good to be here. You've just mentioned there the Ezra Institute. That's my primary work. The Ezra Institute was founded in 2009. We are a Christian world and life view think tank and cultural apologetics training organization. So our concern is with biblical worldview, Christian philosophy, and cultural apologetics. And so we write, speak. We have a publishing house, Ezra Press. We have our podcast. We travel and lecture where we used to travel and lecture. We do what we can, and we host various training opportunities in worldview and cultural apologetics for students, for young adults, and a certain amount of programs for a more generalized audience for pastors and leaders. And we have an annual conference and so on. So that's the Ezra Institute. And over the last couple of years, some of our work seems to have become more pertinent all of a sudden, because we've been talking about these issues of church and state and culture and sphere sovereignty and the need for a robust cultural apologetic for many, many years. And sometimes that's tough sledding to convince people that they need to pay attention to things that maybe they're not that concerned with. They think that's maybe a very highly specialized area that is not really that significant or important to them. And I think the last couple of years, not just the COVID situation, but the legislative environment that we're in now in Canada is starting to drive a lot more interest in what the Ezra Institute has been saying and is saying. So we're encouraged by that. We wish it could have been under less threatening circumstances, but in part we're where we are because we've not given sufficient attention to these broader issues, in our view, as a church and as Christians. And then in 2008, I founded Westminster Chapel, and a few years later, Westminster Classical Christian Academy, which is an elementary school in Toronto. And a few years ago, when the work of the Ezra Institute about 4 years ago started becoming increasingly burdensome in the right sense, right? It was growing and expanding and so on. I decided to step back from the senior leadership of the church, so I play a support role there now on the elders board, and I'm kind of the founding pastor at large, really, and I'm focused on the work of the Institute, which, as I say, is our journal Jubilee and our publishing and our speaking and writing and podcasting and traveling and speaking.
Well, right on. Well, staying busy.
Yeah. Are you guys just completely independent? Or are you associated with any federation? Or
so we are a Canadian charity, and we're independent. So we're an independent Reformed think tank. So no, we have. There's no broader organization to which we're answerable. Which, especially these last 2 years, has been mercy.
Yes,
I think that we've been able to maintain the independence of our voice to the culture,
Right.
but we are very much in dialogue with and conversation with all kinds of like-minded institutions and organizations that we've worked with and partnered with over the years, including groups like ARPA.
Yep.
Andre Schuten's one of our fellows, and so on. So we have actually 18 fellows from around the world, in Canada, Europe, the USA. And the United Kingdom. So, and people can explore that on our website, ezrainstitute.ca, and get a handle on who we are as an organization a bit more.
Yeah.
What does it mean to add a fellow to the organization? Because I've noticed you guys have brought on a number of new faces this year.
Yeah. So for us, our fellows are, it's hopefully a two-way street. So the idea of our fellows program is that like-minded scholars, leaders, occasionally the odd pastor, becomes closely associated with us, usually because they have contributed articles for Jubilee, appeared repeatedly on our podcasts or taught at our programs. And after a number of years of building that relationship, we will periodically invite people to join our team of fellows, and that for them means that they're committing themselves to promoting the work of the Institute, hopefully speaking well of us, and teaching periodically at our programs, contributing articles, and in return, hopefully they're getting a certain amount of exposure for their writing and their work and so on. So we've been excited this year. I think we've added 2 or 3 fellows this year, Dr. James White, Jeff Durbin, and I think Aaron Rock was joined this year as well. Who's he and I have known each other for many years, but it was in these last 18 months that we have sort of reconnected in earnest, and he's been involved quite a bit more in some of our programming. So, and I think his example in church leadership there in Windsor has been really significant. And so we wanted him to come on as our fellow for church leadership.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I know he runs a podcast, and he was actually on with us. So he,
good,
fairly familiar with Aaron Rock. So, and I think a lot of our listeners listen to him. So, you mentioned that the move to kind of to ignore our current cultural state in in that we have kind of let the government run away with it, has kind of been prevalent in our churches, in our Christian culture. Is that also a reality in the broader context? Do we see that more people are coming back to those questions of not, I guess, how they would say sphere sovereignty, but coming back to thinking about authority? What do you see in our culture, maybe just in Southern Ontario or in general?
So I think it's been interesting insofar as it's certainly true that it has the last 2 years have been forcing people to ask some pretty fundamental questions about the nature of the human person. For example, our bodily integrity, our civil liberties, our charter freedoms, such as they were, and so on. So these questions have been forced upon people to a large degree, and there's been some. I think you can see pockets of, and I would say very small pockets in the broader culture of pushback on these issues. I think there's going to be maybe 2 or even 3 new emergent conservative parties in the province by the time the next election rolls around. It would be probably useful if there weren't 3 and those 3 could find a way of working as one.
Yes.
But politics and egos and all of that comes into the mix. So there are, and I think you could look at the performance of the People's Party of Canada in the last election and say, well, was it 5 or 6%, I think, which is a significant jump for them. And that suggests certainly that there are people, a small minority in Canada, who are concerned about these things. We'd probably hear more voices were it not for the fact that so much of the media is bought and paid for. and is government media on massive government subsidies and so on. And so it's very difficult for voices that are resistant to what's going on, are asking some of these bigger questions to get a platform,
Right.
at least in the mainstream. But there are some, and of course you had the Julie Penosi, was it? Case where she was a professor of ethics, I think, at a major Ontario university, and was basically dismissed from her job for not getting the vaccine. And so she's been speaking and writing, and to some degree as well, Jordan Peterson has reappeared a little bit. And been expressing more and more concern about what's going on. So there are pockets, but I wouldn't say I think it's disappointing. If you compare us to our southern neighbor and the amount of pushback there is in the United States, or you compare us even to parts of Europe and the United Kingdom, we just don't see the political resistance or pushback here. And in fact, it seems that sometimes even on the supposed conservative end, we've seen the status quo in more than one area just being reinforced. And of course, with things like a hugely destructive bill in terms of freedom of speech and expression, freedom of religion, Bill C-4, was advanced through the House of Commons and then the Senate, fast-tracked by conservatives. So it's been disappointing, I think, overall in terms of the public political discourse around this and the cultural discourse. There have been a few disparate voices here and there, but usually their voice has been coming through independent, small online platforms like, the Liberty Coalition, for example, and others that are trying to give exposure to some of those voices. And the Liberty Coalition formed out of a group of us pastors saying, how are we going to get more and more Christians and pastors to think about these issues and try and bring them, openly into the, give people an opportunity to give voice to these things. So, it's there is some things are going on, but I would say very small. I think the church kind of reflects that there's a small pockets in the church that are raising the same issues.
Yeah, it's frustrating. It seems to be at a point where folks a lot of people, at least this is more anecdotal perhaps, but are just bending and giving in just because of the coercion, right? The realities are, they have to face reality, and people want to fly, they want to work, they want to do whatever they have to do to live their lives. But you wrote a piece a couple of weeks back on the coercive mandates, on these vaccine mandates. Do you want to just outline that a bit, and then we'll kind of delve into that further?
Yeah, so I wrote a blog called "Against Coercive Mandates: Power, People, and the Politics of Freedom." It was a sort of short blog, and I've written a number of pieces over the last 2 years on this, and I was. To some degree, I was thinking, what else can I say? What else is there to say? I just today released a new blog dealing with Romans 13 and it's called The Limits of Civil Obedience, in which I specifically look at and analyze Romans 13 and a proper interpretation of Romans 13 and what Paul is actually doing there, because that's been I think a badly misused passage. But in that particular blog, I was I kicked off with a quote from Father Abraham Kuyper, and his outspoken opposition to vaccination certificates, and of course it was at the time of the smallpox epidemic, and he warned that there was a let me quote him. He says that the form of tyranny hidden in these vaccination certificates is just as real a threat to the nation's spiritual resources as a smallpox epidemic itself. End quote. And I completely agree with that, and I think the way in which we've been so complacent. I mean, you raised the point that. People seem to have been bought off for a beer a slice of pizza,
Yeah.
well,
not only that, but just-
$100 in some cases.
Yeah.
In other instances, for the easy life, this is the way things are going. Therefore, if I want to have my holiday, and then they think, well, if I get double jabbed, I'll be able to have my holiday. And next thing we know, no, now actually you need to have your PCR test first, and then a PCR test when you land. And then sure enough, we've been told, the redefinition of fully vaccinated is coming. And so there's booster number 1. And then of course there's Omicron, and that doesn't seem to be, according to the latest studies out of Oxford today, the vaccines don't seem to be stopping that effectively. So there'll be no doubt a Pfizer adjusted Omicron version, and ad nauseum, until people actually say, you know what, we're done with this now.
Yeah.
And so I think what I tried to do in the article was address this issue of why are we comfortable? Why are we so shockingly comfortable with what's happening? For the easy life. Mm-hmm. Do our civil liberties and the freedom of the church, especially for Christians as we think about this, does the independence and freedom of the church? I mean, look what's going on in northern BC right now. You've got vaccine passports being mandated. You've got the same going on in southern Manitoba.
For churches.
Mm-hmm. Wow. How long till there are attempts to do that in Ontario? We don't know. Then, of course, you've got some churches that are already applying their own vaccine mandates anyway because of local health guidelines or whatever. How did we get to a point where Jesus healed the sick and we keep them out of our worship services? I mean, Scripture says lay hands on the sick, and we say you can't come in unless you got a vax passport. Yeah. I mean, that's a major problem. Yeah. And the brazenness of the state in Canada in some of these regions is incredible. But of course, they're doing it because they think they can. They believe that there will not be sufficient pushback and that people will do what's necessary. And I fear that somehow we as Canadians have become, we like our cottage and our speedboat and our foreign holidays and our easy life. And we're very blessed here. We've been blessed here for generations financially in our standard of living and the liberties and freedoms we've historically enjoyed. Although this is the first time the Charter's really been put to the test. Didn't do so well, did it? The Americans don't have a Section 1 that you can drive a freight train through in terms of their civil liberties. And maybe we'll come to a comparison actually in a moment with what's happened in the United Kingdom on the whole issue of church and state. But in the blog, I'm saying that why are we comfortable with coercion? We claim as a culture not to be comfortable with coercion. Yeah. We don't want to coerce. We refuse to coerce. Illegal migrants to have proper paperwork. Sure. We refuse to coerce suspected terrorists to be deported out of the country. We refuse to even be willing to coerce women to respect life in the womb, or men to respect the life in the womb. But we're more than happy with, some of the egregious statements that I've heard about, I don't care if they die. People in the medical profession saying unvaccinated people shouldn't be treated or should be left till last. Or, of course, you can't even have an organ transplant now if you're not vaccinated in the Toronto region. Yeah. These are and yet it's as though these things don't seem to register to people, or we're not ready to speak out. And of course, the frightening thing here is this is exactly what we saw in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. It's exactly what we saw in Germany in the 1930s. It's this incremental creep of you can demonize certain people and then you do what you like to them. Yep. And that was the concern of the article. So I talked about there the way in which the worldview issue is so pertinent because the modern, the great Dutch philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd, Christian philosopher, talked about one of the religious worldviews or spiritual motive forces of the modern age. He said is governed by a nature freedom dialectic, and a dialectic basically means is opposing ideas from which we move from one pole to the other. by nature, he meant we have in the modern age a deterministic view of nature, of science, running in terms of these fixed mathematical, physical, material laws. And that's a realm of determinism. Then on the other hand, we have this radical insistence on the freedom of the human personality, right? So how do you maintain absolute freedom in this radically autonomous sense, and yet in a deterministic world in which, you got Dawkins writing about the selfish gene, and, we're basically just the product of atomic determinism. So these sort of two poles, and the solution that our culture effectively came up with in an attempt to synthesize these poles, of course, it doesn't really work, but the idea is with the autonomous freedom of the human personality, we now harness science, in inverted commas. We harness the nature as such, and we bend it to our will, and we move from the science of the 19th and mid through to maybe the mid 20th century of description of reality in order to analyze it, to basically human sciences, so-called the science of man. We go from description to prescription. How do we now plan scientifically the perfect society? How do we use our freedom, our autonomous freedom, using the tools of the sciences to predestine, to plan society? In other words, how do we have a truly planned order? And it's a technocracy, a technocratic society in which experts in elites plan your freedom, in inverted commas. But it's not the freedom that we used to talk about, freedom which meant freedom under law, which is under God, the beginning of the Charter, recognizing the supremacy of God and the rule of law, where there's a standard, a transcendent standard above the state. No, this is the freedom of necessity, which is you must be coerced to be free. The freedom that they are planning for you. And of course, this goes right back to Rousseau and the French Revolution, and that you surrender your individual freedom to the collective, so that you will be free. And some people will need to be coerced into this freedom, which is, of course, a contradiction in terms, but that's the point. It's a dialectic.
Some people will be more free than others.
Exactly. You need and the centralized entity to distribute that.
And you need a strong state. So think about the way the social contract theories that we've adopted now in the West of society actually work. You remove the idea of God over society and his word as sovereign, and you replace it with the sovereignty of man and the ultimacy of man and his order. And you have a group of autonomous people contracting together to agree that this is how society is going to run, and then you can update the contract as you go along, as you see fit. But the problem is, when you're also affirming the freedom of the human personality, how do you maintain unity for society so that it can function when you've got all of these radically free individuals everywhere? Well, the answer is this idea of this contract. But of course, in the contract, the state, the controlling agency, the central agency, has to be emphasized more and more and more and more to retain some semblance of unity in all of this anarchistic diversity. And so that's what we're seeing. And we've now have a sort of cult of the expert, where a small group of elites from specially selected universities, progressive elites, are now going to plan and determine our futures and what society is going to look like. And you see this with
social media all the time.
Absolutely.
Well, it sounds like Sam Harris would have an answer to that. He would just say, well, then we'll come up with meaning. Don't worry.
Yeah,
the science will come up with meaning at some point.
Well, of course, it becomes this in a certain sense is the meaning, which is they believe that because there's no God and there's no revelation from God, they're in a chaotic environment that is threatening to crush them. This is behind the climate cult as well. right? COP26 and the whole notion that, man can alter climate and change the weather. He can do almost any magic trick now. The fundamental idea is that man must be the new God. And he must structure and control reality in such a way that requires, it goes back to Plato and Aristotle and the philosopher kings. You need a small group of elites who will structure and plan reality for us, because you can't be trusted with freedom. The universe is trying to crush you. And unless man frees himself by his sciences and delivers himself into the new utopia of freedom, and that's the right word, we need a planned utopia, a planned society. You've often heard Canada talked about as a social experiment. Yeah. Well, what's the first requirement of any legitimate experiment?
You need controls.
Right. You need a completely controlled environment. Yeah. Otherwise, you can't repeat the experiment, and therefore it's not valid. So control is the prerequisite. So that's what I deal with in this article, this sort of this dialectic. And then I try and highlight the fact that the whole idea of freedom is not self-explanatory. And this is the problem in our culture, is that we've essentially redefined freedom. Instead of it being scripturally and under God, you might say theologically, freedom is now described purely politically. So that, when we talk about freedom, free from what? To be what? I mean, the concept of freedom presupposes you're being freed from something to be something else.
Right.
And so that's relative either to man only or to God. And if freedom is relative only to human beings, then there is no realm of freedom above and beyond the state. There's no appeal above or beyond the state. Only if we can appeal to God as a transcendent authority does freedom for the individual, for the family, for the church, for all of these mediating institutions that protect us from standing naked before the state as merely units to be controlled. This is the critical thing about the advance of the state's intrusion. We can talk about this in a moment when we discuss sphere sovereignty, but the state's intrusion into all these areas means that increasingly the family, the church, the individual are irrelevant. It is the state and its experts that matter, and they will coerce you to be free. They'll coerce you to be healthy. And that requires the stripping of the authority of the family and of the church and of other mediating institutions. And that's why we should be very concerned about the destruction of small business, the total control of medicine by the state, the attempt to say we're going to start injecting children as young as 5 or even younger. It's happening in places without parental consent. These are all radical intrusions into the life of the family. And of course, this is all reflected in Bill C-4 as well in its passage, which basically tells parents what they can and can't, how they can and can't have their children raised and counseled and so on. So this is... Go ahead.
Jump in for a second?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. We should hit sphere sovereignty. We're only doing an hour today. And then also, and talk about what the red line is. But this is a little bit of an aside. I don't know if I've seen you do any writing or any podcasting on this. Do you see some of these centralizing tendencies and like creating a world where, there's certain controls, certain rules in the advancement of the internet and something like the metaverse? Like, have you done any looking into that at all? And do you see those principles at work?
You just lost like 3/4 of our viewership because the metaverse is such a new word too. So
it's good to know.
Yeah, I think what you're driving at there is a concept I have actually written a little bit about, and I wrote a foreword to a book on posthumanism or transhumanism. And this is the idea that the science fiction has been dreaming about these things for a very long time. But for many, the internet and this whole new concept of, or the new wording of this metaverse and supercomputer, quantum computers, and all of this sort of thing, will be the first stage in a united consciousness in what some of the transhumanists call the omega point, at which man, essentially the idea is he merges in his attempt to harness science, to plan and predestine his own future. Man essentially harnesses the evolution. He's now the custodian of evolution himself.
It's the next stage,
and he takes man on a new or final stage of evolution where man has a unified consciousness that stage manages the entire universe.
Yep.
And so you've got ideas like the notion that eventually human beings will be able to download their consciousness into some kind of quantum computer, that there'd be some kind of hive consciousness. I mean, you think about, I don't know whether you guys are Star Trek fans, but if you Star Trek Next Generation, you got these aliens called the Borg, and you don't know Star Trek.
No,
before my time. Go ahead.
So before my time.
Yeah. So Star Trek Next Generation. This is actually a good movie. There's some homework for you guys. Go and watch the movie First Contact with Star Trek, which is about these aliens called the Borg, and they are basically a blend of humanoid and machine. And they have a hive consciousness, and this is what a collective consciousness. And at this point, amongst the transhumanists, the posthumanist thinkers and philosophers, there's of course diversity, but many of them believe at this point man really merges into this kind of transhuman. We go beyond the human by our merger with our technology. And so, yes, there are people dreaming of that. And it's some of those dreams are very dangerous, because they are, again, about that they all require human beings to surrender their freedom, their independence, their liberty in various different ways to be merged into this collective. And some see, the internet, the metaverse, the coming quantum computers as a sort of major first step in this sort of transition of humankind to a next phase of evolution.
It sure seems like we're setting, or the government or culture is setting itself up for just a wonderful storm. So,
although I will say, well, whatever, we don't have to go on to it, but like the fact that if Facebook and Meta succeeds in becoming the dominant metaverse, that makes sense. But if these other cryptocurrencies, which are decentralized, would succeed, then you would have, I guess it would just be will of the people at large, which has tons of its own problems, but would be not this centralized, controlled playground that Facebook wants to do.
Yeah,
it's a disaster.
It
seems like at some point you're just gonna have to turn everything off and go live in a desert.
Yeah, it feels like that sometimes. Yeah.
So that kind of brings us back to sphere sovereignty in this whole situation we find ourselves in Ontario and Canada. Maybe you can break down sphere sovereignty for us in kind of an understandable way that we can, because we can talk about the red line. Like where does this all hit a wall? Like we're not far away from a reality where the government's going to come for your kids because you didn't vaccinate them, or because of your views on homosexuality, or any number of issues. They're already like C4 passed. It's already, we're taking a big step toward that, not tolerating intolerance, which is just, the most dangerous thing if, as a parent, as a church. And so maybe you just can break that down for us and kind of tell us where you see it going.
Well, these things like Bill C4 do fit very neatly into all of this, because it's about the root of the discussion of sphere sovereignty is about the true nature of things. Do created things, created entities, societal institutions have a particular nature that's governed by law, by God's law? And if we're at the point where we are now in Canada, where by fiat, the state can legislate into existence completely new human identities derived from non-scientific radical theories of language and social construction. A lot of this stuff is Judith Butler, Gender Trouble, her book in the early 90s, and the whole idea that male and female are fictive, right? They are
societal constructs.
They're just constructs. That's all they are, and they exist only because of a language regime. So this is why there's a war over pronouns. this, because you repeat the language regime of man and woman, husband, wife, and so on, that's just there to reinforce a pre-existing bourgeois power structure of the family and private property and everything else. But if you change the language regime, you can change our perception of the body, and the body is really a body without organs. It's nothing. It's awaiting cultural signification by our words, and so it's a war on language, which is a war on the Word who created all things. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were made through him. So it's a war on the very idea that there is a Word that governs all things. And that takes us to the concept of the biblical idea of sphere sovereignty that's being, utterly shattered or broken or violated, I should say, in all of this. In this revolt against creation, which is what we're in. So sphere sovereignty is basically, of course, you don't find the expression in the Bible. You don't find the expression Trinity in the Bible either. But that doesn't mean God isn't triune. The expression was coined probably by Abraham Kuyper, but the idea has been around a very, very long time. And God begins, and when you read the creation account, God distinguishes and separates things. He creates things after their kind. Yep. It's one of the big fallacies of evolution, but we won't go there now. He creates things after their kind, so they're distinct from one another, and they're governed by a distinctive law. And so we have the distinction of male and female, of course, in the creation account, but it goes beyond that. And in creation, we also have, first, of course, the individual Adam is created, but then the family is also created by God. And then as we move through Scripture and the biblical narrative, we see that the state is established. Beginnings of the state we see in Genesis 9 after the flood, and then the church. And then there's a process with the work of the gospel in our history. You see a gradual, steady process of differentiation taking place within society that starts to distinguish the God-ordained aspects of life. So in what we might call early iterations of human society, you see the clan or the sib. You see all of the functions of what we would look at in a modern society around education, the life of the church, government, all concentrated in a chief or clan leader or whatever. And what you see with the birth of the church in the Roman world, which centralized all power, there was no area of freedom outside of the totalitarian state in Rome. And in ancient Greece and in ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, you look at all of these ancient empires, but the church was the first truly free institution in the Western world. And that kicked off a process of differentiating these different aspects of life. So we can talk obviously very clearly about the family, the church, the state in Scripture. And you see them differentiated clearly in the Older Testament because you have a number of instances actually where kings tried to behave as priests and were rebuked for it, including Saul and Samuel, but there's Azariah as well. And you see a clear distinction between priesthood and kingship, and you've got a distinction of the independent authority of the family too. You see the theft of Naboth's vineyard with Ahab and so on. So that's the root of it, and the basic idea is that, and usually we illustrate this with circles, and touching circles, is that God has established things, societal institutions, after their kind, and they are governed by their own internal law structure, and that simply means that you don't govern the church like a state or like a family. You don't govern the family like a church or a state. You don't govern the state like a church or a family. They have their own distinctive structure. If you govern the state like a family, what have you got? A mafia.
Yeah.
So you have basically blood comes first, and so you have a mafia. If you govern the family like a church, then well, you've got spiritual abuse, because the family isn't the church. It's of course, families are part of churches, but they are distinct, and you certainly can't govern the. I mean, what would be if I'm an elder in the church, which I am in my own church, and I were to excommunicate my wife on the basis that she cooked burnt dinner or something. You've got a radical mixing of these distinct spheres, and so and when tyranny and abuse of power comes in, is when these different spheres of life overstep their God-ordained function. In the case of the state, it's to be a ministry of justice. That's the biblical requirement. It's there. It's the jural aspect that leads the state. That's its function. The family does not put people in prison, execute people, and so on. That's not its role. It's not its function. The state is fundamentally the coercive institution as a ministry of justice. The state can't be excommunicating people from the life of the church. So those are the basics of sphere sovereignty. And where you don't respect sphere sovereignty, you have totalitarianism. Yep. Now, when you use a word like totalitarianism, people immediately think of frightening dictators like Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, Stalin, and so on, and authoritarian regimes that were also totalitarian. And they look at Canada and they say, "Oh, well, we're not totalitarian in Canada because we don't have jackboots marching up and down the street." But we have become totalitarian because totalitarianism is the swallowing of other spheres of life and authority by one of the spheres. And so what we've got in Canada right now is the treating in a parts to whole fashion, the church, the family, medicine, economic life and business. These are being treated as though they are lesser parts of the state. The parts of the state are municipalities, provinces, and so on. Those are the parts of the state. And on those territories, families, churches, businesses, schools reside, but they are not parts of the state. And so when we reduce human society to the state, you have totalitarianism. And what's been on terrifying display these last 2 years, and of course we're seeing it even worse in some places like Germany and Austria. It's
going door to door.
Interesting that it's those countries that.
History buff. But,
so ironic.
But they're actually the vaccination mandates are becoming mandatory.
Yeah.
And with the fines and in Austria, prison sentences looming, and you've seen some very extreme behaviour in Australia as well. Although we've got money has been dished out this fall in BC and in Ontario for our own detention camps. You're probably aware of that they're building. The federal government has given those two provinces money for quarantine camps. So who knows where all of that will go. But the point is that I'm making is that totalitarianism is this treating of these other parts of society, of human society, as lesser parts of the state, and not respecting the boundaries. And they know they're doing it because that's why you need emergency powers.
Yes.
They know that they are overstepping the legitimate authority of the state, which is why they keep extending emergency powers in inverted commas. And as you know from history, when states take to themselves additional powers, you see it in the West after powers of taxation and so forth after World War II.
9/11.
They give them back right away.
They give them back straight away, and that's the frightening aspect of all of this.
Yeah.
And some people seem to be just thinking, oh well, eventually all of this will go away. Bill C-4, Bill C-36, Bill C. Well, then they've not gone away, and I don't see in the short term these coercive measures disappearing anytime soon either. Exactly what form they will be in the months and years ahead, it's hard to say. But what's happened, these restrictions are never unthinkable again, and that's the problem.
So, where do we go from here? Because it's just been creeping year over year, kind of throughout.
When does it go from coercive to like, I don't know what the word would be, like beyond them pushing you to get your kids vaccinated or beyond them pushing you to have a certain view on something to like, that is a mandatory, societal requirement.
Like, what do you do? Do you speak up about it, or like, do you wait till they come to your door? To like it's, I think people are kind of like we were talking about, I think maybe a bit at the beginning or even off air too. Just the general attitude is just one of despair.
Yeah, it sounds like it's radical, and it sounds like, but you see these mandates coming to churches, and then they're already they're vaccinating kids up to 5. And what's going to happen when your 4-year-old's going to school in a couple of years, or whatever, 3-year-old's going to school in a couple of years, and they require that vaccine. And you as a parent need to be able to exercise your authority, but you can't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've heard Dr. Tam recently, at the federal level, talking about the importance of the forthcoming importance of infant immunization, so this is these are not unrealistic or fanciful questions to be asking. I think fundamentally we have to remember that the state only has the power that people allow to it. Now, you have to ask the question, the most fundamental question is, what is the basis or the foundation of state authority? Do we submit to the state simply because they have the guns and they have the money that they're taking from the citizenry? Is that because for the non-Christian who doesn't believe in God, they have no particular reason to obey the state other than that the state has a monopoly on the means of coercion, and it has the money. Yep. The Christian has a more positive duty to submit to the state in all things lawful, because we recognize the state is ordained by God in its sovereign sphere. But the question then becomes, what do you do when the state is no longer a terror to those that do evil, but becomes a terror to those that do good, to the law-abiding, to the God-honoring, and it starts to persecute the righteous? What do you do at that point? And of course, the first answer is that, and what you've seen some pastors doing and some churches doing, is passive resistance. You have to resist. The more you surrender freedoms, the more will be taken from you. So the state can only go so far as, in fact, I would argue that the church has had the power to stop this in its tracks nearly 18 months ago. You may recall that I was engaged in leading something called the Reopen Ontario Churches campaign with Aaron Rock. We wrote a letter, and then we pursued signatories. I can't remember how many it was now, maybe 400 somewhere there, 450, something like that. Churches eventually signed it, and that got us a meeting with government officials. And I think that meeting was on a Friday, and by the Monday they were announcing the churches could open 30%. At that time, I think the Ontario government was under the distinct impression that there would be a major problem for them of enforcement if they did not open the churches. But then what started to happen is the churches and the various movements, especially in light of what we were trying to do, were all breaking ranks and not insisting on the freedom of the church. And you had your statements from the Anglicans and from the Mennonites and all of this, so that all of a sudden sphere sovereignty was no longer a Christian principle, broadly Christian. It was just a very narrow, small group of evangelical Reformed folk who kind of think that, but they're in a small minority, and that was the impression the government is then given. And so they think they can do what they want. And one of the interesting things in Canada is in the courts, we haven't had a single victory on this. Not a single victory. And you compare that to the USA,
right, where they're getting getting victories everywhere,
where they're getting victories all over the place. I mean, even Biden can't do what he wants right now with respect to the vaccination mandates for businesses, over 100 or whatever it is. It's all been blocked. Churches were winning their cases. And in the United Kingdom, in the UK, there Scottish pastors sued the Scottish government. 27 of them sued the Scottish government when they locked down the church, and it went to the Scottish High Court. And the QC, the lawyer representing the churches, opened their case to the judge in almost verbatim in this way. He said, "I make no apology for opening my case by saying Jesus is Lord." And they won the case. They won the case. They defeated the government on the basis that Christ is Lord of his church. The judge said that that the attempt to lock down the Church of Christ had not happened in over 300 years, and he ordered the Scottish government, to reopen the churches. Just the threat of legal action in England against the government on church lockdowns had them not introduce any lockdown mandates in 2021.
Wow.
Just the threat of legal action. So that's one of the troubling things about the Canadian situation right now, is we're out on a limb to some degree with comparable jurisdictions. So obviously that you've got to go to battle on multiple fronts.
Yep.
One is you've got to keep speaking,
Yep.
because as soon as you stop speaking, eventually, if you can't speak freely, you can't have soon enough. You can't have an opinion, and that's what we're seeing now because we haven't spoken forcefully, faithfully, openly on human identity and sexual ethics, and stood our ground on it, and have just surrendered and privatized and privatized and privatized till our faith is something that exists between the air between our ears. We've now got legislation criminalizing us if we, as pastors, counsel people in terms of a normative human identity according to Scripture. It's an anti-conversion law. It's not an anti-conversion therapy law. It's an anti-conversion law. So if you stop speaking, this is what happens. So you have to speak, and not enough leaders have spoken out. Then you have to resist, passive resistance. So you remain open. You don't comply with intrusive and lawless mandates. Where in Scripture does it say that the state is the ministry of health?
Yeah, right.
Where is that? Where as Christians do we get the notion from?
It used to always be the church. They made the hospitals and all that.
Right. We built the hospitals. We paid for them.
Yeah.
And the notion that the state is the sole arbiter of human health is a terrifying prospect.
Is that because we don't have a history in Canada the same as, say, these other places do? Even the States doesn't really have a deep history, but the UK would. Like they can go back years,
hundreds of years to Magna
years.
Carta, yeah,
and they see things play out in their society, and we just don't have that here. We're just accepting that universal. Like, I mean, I even grew up thinking universal healthcare was just like, oh, other people don't have that. That's wild. And then you start to think about like why, and you start realizing that it's not really that good of an idea.
No,
and never thought about that, and no one ever said maybe this isn't a good idea. It just was a thing.
No, the opposite. It's the only thing you can't touch.
Yeah,
right.
So, and I think actually some of this goes back to Tommy Douglas and professing Christians in this country. Yeah, and some of their ideas. If you actually go and look at what Tommy Douglas believed about about a variety of things, including eugenics.
Yeah.
Pretty terrifying stuff. We've got to remember that the notion of socialized medicine and of the state control of medicine. What have we got from the state control of medicine now? We've got abortion on demand, right through to term. We've got the denial of the conscience rights of doctors now. They've lost in the courts their battle to not have to refer for euthanasia. We've got the expansion of MAID. The people that the churches want to trust, right? These experts, these government figures that so many churches and church leaders want to trust and submit to, are the people that have just taken away our freedom to counsel people in terms of a normative human identity of male and female. And we're paying for sex change surgeries, right, through socialized medicine. And you don't even have the option of going to a private health hospital in Canada. We don't even have the option, right? Even in Britain, where you've got the National Health Service, you've got 7% of the population using private medicine now.
Right.
And of course, you've got private medicine in the US. So the dangers and here's the thing, because the state is the properly coercive institution, it has its proper role to deal with issues of justice, of courts, criminality and so on, administrative law. And it's necessarily coercive. That's why you have to be so careful where you bring it. Because if you bring the state into the heart of education, you've got government education.
Yeah.
And actually, our Reformed community was historically better at recognizing, no, we can't have the state dictating the education of our children. Why are we comfortable with it dictating our health?
Yeah.
You bring the state into the heart.
It's
convenient. And it's supposedly free.
Although, yeah, so is our school, I guess. But that's inconvenient for us.
You bring the state into the heart of medicine, and you get abortion, all these sex change surgeries, euthanasia. Wherever you bring the state, if that state is secular, humanist, pagan, it brings its own nature to everything that it does, which is coercive. Mm-hmm. So if you bring the state into the heart of health and say, well, public health is the sole responsibility of the state. It's not a collective effort of family, small business, of the church, as historically we viewed it. Don't forget, socialized medicine's a new thing. It came in after World War II in Britain. Right, the NHS, and it's recent here. Even state education is late 19th century history. Just because things are the way they are doesn't mean they should be that way. And of course, the welfare states of Europe are bankrupt.
Yeah,
and so are we. In fact, Ontario is the most indebted sub-sovereign territory in the Western world. Yep. So where do we think all that's leading? So all of this coercion, it has to be resisted, and that starts with having the courage to speak. And then there's passive resistance, and then of course there's civil disobedience, which is more active resistance. And of course, the Reform community has a long history of this. Without civil disobedience, there would have been no evangelical Reformed church in Europe. It wouldn't have existed. Yep. It was required for the preservation of the gains of the Reformation. Look at John Knox's admonition to England. Look at Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex, the Puritans. Look at the work of the Anti-Revolutionary Party, Groen van Prinsterer, Abraham Kuyper, and so on in the Netherlands. I mean, England and the Netherlands, they're probably the two most important nations in terms of the expansion of religious freedom and the freedom of the church. You look at the English Revolution, Cromwell, go on to take a look at the American Revolution. So resistance for Christians has always, certainly of the Reform stripe, gone beyond mere passive resistance eventually to, if necessary, civil disobedience.
And it starts in the church in all these instances.
And it started in the church because the church should be the most sensitive institution to the issue of freedom, because we are the first truly free institution in the history of the Western world. And if the freedom of the church disappears, freedom for society disappears with it. Yep. And in fact, I was reading an article in the Daily Telegraph, a major broadsheet in the UK, just the other day, where the journalists there are starting to complain vociferously about the silence, and so non-Christians, about the silence and surrender of the church and spiritual leaders in Britain, about the oppression of the weak and the surrender of freedoms in all of this coercion. Totally. So those who've said, oh, watch your witness, don't resist, submit, because that's good for our witness as a church. No, it isn't.
Yeah. See that, and then the government's using that now in their literature about if you're applying for an exemption to fly based on religious grounds, they write right in the form, please be aware that the following religious organizations have come out in favor of the mandate. Yeah. And they list like Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and they just list everybody. I mean, Reformed Christianity's not in there yet, but they use that as soon as they can get some leader of a religious organization on the hook. They use it in order to say, well, you're actually a Roman Catholic. Well, you know what? You believe something that, has been said for you. So.
You're absolutely right. You know what, guys? There was an article that appeared a few weeks back in the National Post, and it was at a time when a lot of Christians' jobs were in the balance. Christians across the province applying for religious exemptions because for conscience reasons, they didn't feel that for them they wanted to maintain their bodily integrity and bodily autonomy under God. It's like Herman Dooyeweerd says in the 1920s in his opposition to compulsory vaccination. He said, the human body is inseparable from the ethical person of man. Personhood should never be infringed by the government. The government may not, according to God's ordinances, force the ethically free man to accept physical treatment in any form. The ethical person alone is appointed by God as the keeper and caretaker of the body. And he concludes this way: whoever accepts compulsory vaccination in principle has deprived himself of the moral ground for opposing usurpation by government of individual liberty. And if you coerce people on pain of losing their job, I mean, you are denying the freedom of the ethical person. You're treating a person as a thing.
It's evil.
It's wicked. And so at a time when people were in good conscience applying for exemptions across the province, especially people in the medical profession, an article appeared by two professing Christians lawyers in the National Post saying there's nothing especially Christian about, rejecting the vaccination, and tried to deny that it was an issue of conscience. Now, imagine the effect of that on the employer who sat at his computer Monday morning and thinking, I've got this stack of religious exemption applications. Oh, look at this article in the National Post. Two Christian lawyers saying that this is not a Christian conscience issue.
Yeah. You smarter than the lawyers? Come on.
Yeah. And so, as you say, when the church leaders do it as well, then, of course, the vast majority of these exemption requests were all denied. And so I've known loads of people who are wonderful people exceptional at their jobs, who've losing their livelihoods or lost them already, lost their careers because they will not accept a state-mandated medical therapy for a disease that 99.7 or thereabouts people we know survive, for something that we've got outbreaks among. I was just mentioning to you before the show started, all over the place amongst vaccinated people. The police have got an outbreak in Toronto amongst double vaccinated police officers. We know this vaccine is leaky. What is it what is driving the notion that this is somehow for our health and our benefit, that children who are almost zero risk from this thing should be being jabbed up? No, there's something very wrong with this picture. And it's been very disappointing to see that oftentimes more non-Christians have seen this and written about it than Christians themselves. So yes, we have scored some serious own goals. That's what you're saying there in this whole situation. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. And the failure for Christians to unite around this issue of freedom from coercion and the freedom of the church to not be coerced by the state to introduce all kinds of draconian measures. I mean, we've all been in these situations. You go into one of these, well, of course you can't now if you're not vaxxed. You go into a restaurant or these settings and everybody's sat down eating. That's fine. But in a church, you can't sing. You got to be masked. You need to be physically distanced. You got to be at this capacity limit or that capacity limit, or even in some places now, compulsory vaccination. These things are entirely unacceptable, and they are a complete violation of the principle of sphere sovereignty.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, well, resist. That's the message. That's the message.
Yeah, I think we're out of time for you, but.
I notice you've got a picture of C.S. Lewis on your wall there.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe I should conclude my remarks with a brief citation from C.S. Lewis that's in my blog article. I say this, and bear in mind now we're thinking about Bill C-4 as well. I write here, we undoubtedly live in a dangerous culture where cadres of benevolent experts go about as demigods, trying to free us from our created nature as persons made in God's image. But like a lemur freed of his tail, an elephant of his tusks, or a man of his testicles, such freedom merely destroys the very thing it claims to liberate. God spare us from such abuse in the name of health. For as C.S. Lewis warned, of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive.
Yeah, which is really the bottom line. It's like it's played as good, and that's it's played off as mercy, compassion, and for the good of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically to the mandate itself, whatever you think about the vaccine, the mandate is really the thing we got to start thinking about a lot more. So
thanks for having me on the show. If people want to track with any of our materials, EzraInstitute.ca is our website. They can follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
Sure.
People can follow me on Twitter if they want at Dr. Joe Boot. Check out Ezra Press and our resources because they're there to try and resource and encourage the church to stand for sphere sovereignty, the lordship of Jesus Christ, his authority over every single area of life, and developing a cultural apologetic so that we do learn to respond and resist where human institutions try and take the place of God and become messianic in their thinking and in their reach.
For sure. Well, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Keep having real talk. Catch you next time, folks.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.